What is a buyer's representation agreement? Well, a buyer's representation agreement is a document that outlines the obligations of a broker or the agent representing that broker and the client, the buyer. So basically, there are obligations on both sides, what the broker or the agent does for the client and what their responsibilities and obligations are. And also, there are some obligations of the client to be loyal, to make sure that basically we're saying, I'm your agent, I'm going to work for you, I am going to look out for your best interests, and Mr. Buyer, it is your job to make sure and tell other agents and brokers and anyone along the process that you have representation so that you are loyal to the agent as well. So that's kind of what it's all about, but it also has a term for the contract, so it has a start date and a stop date. You could also write in just an address or one day. It could be 3 months, it could be 6 months, it could be for a week. So the agreement is between the buyer and the agent, and that can all be worked out what seems best for the buyer at the time. Just so you know, it is required that we have a buyer's representation agreement with our clients now before we show them even one house. Now, as a listing agent, I can show a buyer a home that is listed by me for my seller, but if I don't represent the seller, I can't just show a buyer any house without having a buyer's representation agreement. Personally, I like to sit down with a client that is a potential buyer and get to know them, tell them who we are, what our team does, how we represent our clients, what our role is, and I go over all of the documentation that is involved, and I try to get to know them a little bit. And then I let them know, what is my fee? How do I work? What does it look like to work with me? What questions do you have? I like to set up a search and write down all the criteria of all of the things that they're looking for in a home. We talk about school district. We talk about, what are the specific bedrooms that you need? What square footage is important to you? Do you need a yard? Do you need a fence? All kinds of things. I get all the criteria for a search for their home that they're looking for, their price range. We talk about whether or not they're pre-qualified. I'll refer them to a lender, all of those things. So we sit down and we do that. And usually by the end of that, I've answered all of their questions. We've gotten to know each other and they feel confident to hire me and sign a buyer's representation agreement, which says I am their agent, they are my client, we're working together to find the right home for them, that I will walk them through the process and I will be looking out for their best interests the whole time. And that is what a buyer's representation document outlines. It talks about any compensation involved, and it does define that the compensation, the buyer needs to understand that when they hire that agent, they are responsible for the agent's compensation. Now, as a buyer's agent, we can ask the seller to pay for the compensation for the buyer's agent. All of that is negotiable. So when we make offers, sometimes we do ask for that, and a lot of times the seller will pay for that. But a buyer needs to understand that the buyer's representation agreement clearly states that if a seller does not pay that compensation, the buyer is responsible to pay their buyer's agent. So that is all very clearly written out. There's other information in the buyer's representation agreement. Make sure that we, keep your information confidential. It talks about if something were to go wrong and there were attorneys that had to be involved, it lays out all of that information. It talks about any addenda that is attached to this. Like we always give a document called Information About Brokerage Services, which tells what brokers do and how agents work. We could attach a general information that just gives a lot of great information and definitions. Sometimes we will check that box and we'll make sure to give that to our buyers just so it's really helpful information. Wire fraud, we cover wire fraud. We make sure that they understand we're not going to ask you to wire any money to us or in an email. So there's all the addenda that you can check that come along with that. And then there's some special notices. A broker is not a pest inspector. A broker is not an appraiser. A broker is not a surveyor. And then it just talks about, you could be being recorded when you're viewing a property, things like that. So it's just really good information about the relationship between a buyer and their agent and the obligations of both of them throughout that process. and specifically compensation, so that's really, really clear and transparent what the buyer's agent charges and what their responsibilities are, and that the client's going to be loyal to that agent. So that's what a buyer's representation agreement is. If you were to call Zillow or Realtor and ask to go to see a home, and an agent were to show you that home without requiring you to sign a buyer's representation agreement, unless they are the listing agent for that property, they're breaking the rules. So you need to make sure that if you are a buyer looking at homes, if you call an agent and they tell you you have to sign a buyer's representation agreement, I would recommend that you sit down with that agent, get to know them, ask all the questions that you have, and feel good about it, and sign an agreement to agree to work with your agent. If you just want to see one house to kind of get to know that agent, you can make sure that that agreement is just written for one house or one day or 1 week. So there's ways that you can go about doing that, but I would just say, as always, read the fine print and don't sign anything that you don't understand. And if you want any information about this or you have questions about it, reach out to me, reach out to my team. We would be happy to answer any questions and help you find the right property. So thanks for watching, and if you will like and subscribe, it will be greatly appreciated. Have a great day. Bye-bye.